the offensive operation of the Ukrainian Defense Forces in the Belgorod region, a new agreement, or more precisely, new details regarding the Mineral Resources Agreement. Donald Trump demands reparations from Europeans and the repayment of debts. About this and more in my traditional briefing for you. Greetings, friends, on my channel. I am Alexander Musienko, and traditionally at this time, I provide you with operational information on those events that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. Well, firstly, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, made a statement regarding the presence of Ukrainian forces in the Belgorod region. As the President of Ukraine noted in his address, today the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Alexander Syrsky, reported the front presence in the Kursk region and our presence in the Belgorod region. We continue to conduct active operations in the border areas on enemy territory, and this is absolutely justified. The war should return to where it came from. The main goal, as before, is to protect our land as much as possible, to protect the Sumy region and the Kharkiv region from Russian occupiers. The Commander-in-Chief reported on the activity of our units along the extended front line along the border, also in the so-called gray zone and directly on enemy territory, noted the Commander-in-Chief. The Supreme Commander-in-Chief, of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, President of Ukraine Zelensky. So, in this way, the President of Ukraine has effectively acknowledged what we, I think, suspected about the presence of our forces. Earlier I explained the actions and maneuvers of the Ukrainian Defense Forces aimed at delivering preemptive strikes on the territory of the enemy, on Russian territory, to operate there and prevent the adversary to endure hostilities here to the territory of Sumy and Kharkiv regions in order to prevent these maneuvers. And when we talk about the offensive actions of the enemy, when we talk about Russia accumulating forces and resources, then of course these forces and resources need to be destroyed on the enemy's territory. The more that is destroyed there, the less the enemy will be able to transfer to our territory, and the faster the pace of their operations will be disrupted. What do we need to understand? It is necessary to realize that the enemy is preparing their forces. They are deploying them and essentially forming battle formations for conducting offensive actions. Ukrainian forces are focusing on preventing this operation from unfolding with larger forces to enter the territory of the Kharkiv and Sumy regions. In other words, these are actions within the framework of an active maneuver defense regime, and at the same time striking the enemy on their territory. Plus, this is yet another demonstration of the capabilities of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, the armed forces, which can conduct, among other things, such counter-offensive operations and actions, the goal of which is not a large-scale advance into Russian territory, but to prevent the deployment of Russian troops and their advance into our territory. And we see that this strategy and tactics are working and proving successful. And may it continue to be so. Meanwhile, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Alexander Syrsky, emphasized the increase in drones and UAVs within our units, and their role on the battlefield providing relevant data. And here the statistics continue to pleasantly surprise, and it does not stop surprising. In fact, in March, over 77,000 enemy targets were hit and destroyed using various types of drones. This is 10% more than in February. Thank you to the warriors for the professional and effective execution of combat missions, noted General Alexander Syrsky. Indeed, we see that the role of drones is increasing, that the role of drones is playing an ever greater role. And of course now, the defense forces of Ukraine and manufacturers are focusing not only on increasing the quantity. Quantity, of course, is needed, and the more means of destruction there are, ranging from deep strikes into Russian territory, to drones needed for destroying enemy equipment and forces on occupied territories. Along the line of combat engagement, the better. The more we increase our component, and it's very important to understand this, and we see that it works. Well, overall, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, noted that there are now already 12 companies that systematically produce in significant quantities drones on fiber optics. This is also what is needed. Before this, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, General Syrsky, noted that Ukraine already has the capabilities and possibilities to deploy drones on fiber optics with a range of 20 kilometers. Well, this is quite a significant result. Meanwhile, in Osa and Khortytsia, they calculated how much it cost the occupiers to advance deeper into Ukrainian territory. So according to Osa Khortytsia, in the first 3 months of 2025, on average, for each square kilometer of Ukrainian land, Russia lost 146 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and 4.5 artillery pieces. Well, I just want to remind you that the British Army Command calculated last year how many forces Russia would need to simultaneously engage in order to attempt an offensive operation towards Zaporizhzhia. And they calculated that in order to capture, for example, Zaporizhzhia, the enemy would need to simultaneously engage 2 million forces and spend from 4 months to half a year at least. This is the minimum period up to half a year, if not more, in order to advance and attempt to implement the plan. But as of today, the enemy does not have such a grouping, and there are no trends indicating that Russia can simultaneously mobilize such forces and properly equip and arm them. For carrying out such tasks, the prospects are also not visible today. This is the cost. We cannot calculate the threshold of how many losses Russia must incur. The more the better we understand. And it's a thankless task to say when this threshold of sensitivity will actually be reached. When the enemy realizes that the losses are so irreparable that they can no longer conduct offensive actions at all. But with all this, we can calculate how much it currently costs the enemy and how much effort they would need. That's the situation. Meanwhile, an interview was given by the commander of the Ukrainian Naval Forces, Oleksandr Neshpapa. He noted that the Kerch Bridge, which connects occupied Crimea with the territory of Russia, remains a target for Ukraine's defense forces, but he emphasized the need to maintain information silence. This was noted by Mr. Neshpapa. The interview was for Krim.Reali and Radio Svoboda. And here is a direct quote. Of course, the bridge is a complex target, especially now. But in life, there is no fortress that cannot be destroyed. There are no borders that cannot be crossed. The bridge is the same. It's the same target as the rest. At the same time, the commander of the naval forces emphasized that to achieve success, it is necessary to maintain information silence. And if we say that we will strike the Crimean bridge tomorrow, then surely the enemy will find out about it through television. Or we say that we won't strike. Well, that's not right. But at the same time, we see that the commander of the naval forces notes that, and this is a fact, this is actually the target indeed. Because I want to remind you that there were recent reports about the presence being recorded, possibly. German publications reported about the presence of North Korean troops and artillery systems in occupied Crimea, which could possibly be transferred from there to the occupied south and further used in the Zaporizhzhia direction. That is, such activity was recorded. And of course, the Crimean bridge, which has, let's say, lost much of its logistical function compared to before because the enemy found alternative routes. But from time to time, it continues to be used by Russian forces to transport their weapons, troops, and equipment for further deployment through occupied Crimea to the southern directions of Zaporizhzhia and the Kherson regions of the occupied part. At the same time, Russia has built a layered defense system which has complicated Ukrainian attacks using maritime drones. They used to be able to enter the Sevastopol Bay calmly. This is also from an interview on drones. Now it's not so simple, because the enemy has created a layered defense system, starting with a layered long-range detection system, medium, and close-range detection zones of our unmanned systems. We must be more flexible, be smarter, and always stay ahead in technology. And those sea drones that were just kamikaze are almost history now. Now, these sea drones themselves must carry various weapons with different directions of application to be more effective and successful. Indeed, recently another development for the armed forces was presented, a drone that is capable of directly carrying weaponry. This weaponry includes torpedoes, missiles, and manpads. That is, we are actually seeing improvements in systems and our capabilities and possibilities. This is very important. At sea, we are truly demonstrating successes. Well, and the international bloc, which is quite complex because from what has emerged, Donald Trump, the president of the USA, well, firstly, he noted during a meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, that he is actually very dissatisfied of the bombings of Ukraine by Russia. He said that Russia is bombing, it's something abnormal, just crazy. What is happening? He talks about the need to negotiate. Well, actually, and Congresswoman Spart stated that Ukrainians should concede territories. She, by the way, is an American of Ukrainian descent. I want to remind you, that's how it happens. She stated that Ukrainians should concede territories and demand the resignation of President Volodymyr Zelensky. This is what Spart said in an interview with the British The Telegraph. I just don't understand how Ukraine can be set on preserving territories. If they were winning the war, it would be a completely different matter. Spart insists that in the current situation, there are no easy solutions, and the war needs to be won quickly, because otherwise, what lasts long does not end very well for democracy. And Spart holds contempt for former US President Joe Biden. Well, and what, in fact, and nothing in fact, and nothing from which in fact, and nothing, no, regarding Ukrainian President Zelensky. She accused him of doing a disservice to the Ukrainian people and insulting the American president. No one insulted anyone, and there were no direct insults. Moreover, I want to remind, especially the Congresswoman, that Ukraine is in an absolutely constructive process with absolutely normal behavior from the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. We are set constructively and pragmatically. It was Ukraine that agreed to the American initiative for a complete and unconditional ceasefire, and this position remains valid. We support it. However, Russia, according to President Trump, continues the bombings, and this is abnormal. Of course, we would like to see more decisive actions against these Russian attacks and the blatant terror from the enemy. Ukraine is convening a meeting of the UN Security Council today, precisely to inform about the strikes, the horrific terrorist strikes against the civilian population by Russia in Kryvyi Rih, Kharkiv, Kiev region, Mykolaiv region, Kherson region, Donetsk region, Sumy region, where they do not cease, where the enemy continues to attack and strike. Of course, we should not expect progress. Response. The OSCE, convened by Ukraine, and the UN Security Council, but certainly diplomats must use all platforms to draw attention to the terror Russia is committing and how to increase resistance to it. Well, and meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has set conditions for negotiations regarding tariffs with Europe, which, according to the American president, behaved very badly. So, Donald Trump, in comments to journalists aboard Air Force One, the #1 aircraft, precisely when he was flying from Florida to Tun, the airbase, Andrews of Washington, he noted the following, that he will negotiate with Europe regarding tariff changes if Europe does not pay a lot of money. Direct speech from the US President. The United States cannot lose over almost $2 trillion in trade. We cannot allow this, especially while also spending large amounts on NATO to protect European countries. We cover them militarily, and in the meantime, we suffer trade losses. And according to Trump, Europe wants to come to the negotiating table, but this will not happen until they start paying us a lot of money every year. First for the present, but also for the past. Because they have taken a lot of our wealth, and we will not allow this anymore. The opposition actually, the position of the US president remains firm that security must be paid for. And this position, by the way, is in many ways similar. And regarding Ukraine, it is unchanged. That security must be paid for, and we too must be prepared to consider economic interests. What is Trump hinting at? Trump is hinting that the US has guaranteed security and protection, and that must be paid for. This is a direct reference to what US Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke about during his recent European tour. During his visit to Brussels, Rubio spoke about the US wanting European countries to increase their defense and security spending to at least 5% of their GDP. In other words, this position is effectively confirmed by the American president, that they would like this and that it is indeed desirable. Well, in general, it's curious how Europeans will react and whether they will want to pay and increase spending. The question remains. But there is another question that reflects the sentiments of Americans. So, the Wall Street Journal reports that Republican voters are increasingly not supporting aid to Ukraine. In a new poll, 83% of Democratic Party supporters were in favor of continuing US financial aid to Ukraine, while 79% of Republicans expressed opposition to this initiative. And this is essentially the situation. Overall, 49% of the total number of Americans surveyed by the Wall Street Journal for this poll support continuing aid to Ukraine, while 44% do not support it. And the majority, as I already mentioned, over 2/3 of Republican Party voters do not support it and favor reducing expenditures. Here is also an explanation of how Trump acts, shaping the rhetoric and the Republicans. But here, it is important to understand the following. For example, President Trump and certain representatives of the Republican Party have opposed conducting certain operations. And now, for instance, a military operation might be conducted in Yemen. And this needs to be understood. What is this? At the same time, despite everything, this is what they initially opposed. But it is possible. In other words, the position is changing. Elites are capable of changing their point of view. Will Trump change? It's hard to say. But it is not excluded, and it cannot be ruled out. We will see, of course, in the near future. Well, we continue, friends, with confidence and God's help, to move only forward. We are strong, we will endure. Take care of yourselves, and glory to Ukraine.